Good morning. Can you hear me okay? 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 That's gonna be annoying. Can you hear me? That's gonna be annoying. Can I get a thumbs up in chat if you guys can hear me? Just to make sure all the sources are working. Good morning. Good morning. There's an echo. Is there still an echo? Okay, cool. Let's give it a little bit of time for people to filter in here. I don't really know how this works. I don't know how to see who's in here or not. Interesting. Okay, so OBS just isn't slow to update. Okay, no real agenda for this. I know that a lot of people had some questions and a lot of confusion around xNFT protocols and the App Store. So this is just kind of like a general walkthrough for developers, kind of have an explanation of the whole repo. I guess we'll kind of go through the repo and do general Q&A and just hang out, answer questions. No, like you don't have to stick on topic. I'm fine with answering whatever questions anybody's got, but the general theme is going to be around xNFTs. But we'll give it another, let's call it like 5 minutes, and then we'll actually get started. The updating process. The updating process is basically the same as publishing. Um, so let me show you. So if you've published an XNFT, you go down, there's this My XNFTs tab where you can just go to /me and take you to your profile. The App Store will show you all of the ones that you've installed. And then down here at the bottom, it'll show you some published ones. Depending on the type of XNFT it is, if it's an app or a collectible, these meta action buttons will change or show different ones depending on what actions are available to that. But all of them should have this edit. So if I wanted to edit my mnemonics one, just this modal pops up and you just provide a new zip manifest that you would have done during publishing. And the App Store does the diff and ships it off to a worker that manages the publishing and the propagation of the updates and does the transactions that you'll sign. But editing is more or less identical to publishing. It's just from this entry point instead of the /publish page that you'd go to here. xNFT is a kind of, or is xNFT a kind of NFT standard like Metaplex? I guess you can call it a standard, not, I don't know, standard makes it sound like everybody kind of has to conform to it. All xNFTs are Metaplex compliant NFTs, if that helps. Um, xNFTs are more or less just like a program account and metadata wrapper on top of what the current MPL standard is for them. So we do purely additive changes to existing NFTs, or if you're creating an app, then we mint a brand new NFT that is MPL compliant and then add our additive data on top of that. So hopefully that clears that up. But like I don't know, standard. I guess it's a standard from the sense that we have our own metadata format and JSON structure that sort of needs to be adhered to be compliant. And I'll get to that once we start going through the code. But otherwise, it's not as complex as like a Metaplex standard would be. Feel free to throw questions in chat before we get started. Crypto Twitter, so weird sometimes. What languages can the xNFT app bundle be written in? Anything that can run on a web platform. So obviously JavaScript. Um, we are experimenting with Java applets, trying to see if that'll work because of a specific project that somebody's trying to work on. So that may or may not be possible. I know that we're trying to figure that out at the moment. I would assume properly compiled WASM would work, um, but you can either have like an existing website that you just wrap in an iframe and publish as an xNFT. So obviously, if that's hosted somewhere else, your only limitation is that hosting platform and what they can functionally run. But if you want to run code native, then anything that can work with React Native. So I know that there are WebAssembly transpilers for React Native, so WebAssembly is definitely one of them, aside from regular React and JavaScript. Maybe Java applets. So yeah, I don't know. Anything that can basically either function on a web platform and hosted remotely to be referenced, or anything that can functionally be built and bundled with React Native, because that's what we're kind of pushing everybody to use at this point for a potential future state of Saga native xNFTs, which hopefully comes true. Okay, I guess we'll get started. So my plan is to just start with the program itself, and then we'll work our way down through the rest of the repository. Um, I guess that's a good plan to do, since this is the heart of everything that stems from it. And then I'll try and maintain my ADHD enough to pay attention to chat and answer questions as they come. Okay, so just like any other Anchor program, which this is written in, we've got our entry point librs. It's got our definition of some constants, our security txt, program ID, all of our instructions, and um, our custom error. Actually, before I get started, everybody should know that this is open source and you can read and contribute to it freely. If you didn't know that, you do now. Why can I not paste into OBS? Interesting. Okay. There you go. That's the link to the repository. Okay, so we've got all of our instructions here. We've got some security stuff and our error codes. Nothing too special. Kind of want to abstract away all of the complexity from the entry point so that people coming in can just like look at what the instructions are, look at the parameters if they want to, and error codes in here without having to scroll through thousands and thousands of lines of code just to see what the functions are. Nothing too special in here. All of the details in here can also be found in the individual instructions. So that's fine. Same thing, top level events that are emitted in each of the relevant instructions. It could probably be more added here if you're looking to contribute to the repository. More event emissions at the end of successful instructions could be useful, potentially for indexing down the road. So if anybody sees a reason to add an event and wants to do that, feel free to. But yeah, it's in the events RS. Let's see, let's look at state first. That's kind of important. Start with the xNFT state. So xNFTs in and of themselves are basically just logical PDA wrappers over top of an existing xNFT, or sorry, an existing NFT, or a new one that we create for you based off of the kind that you're minting. Regardless of what path you go down, whether you do an app or a collectible, they're all going to be Metaplex compliant and leverage. Yes, this is recorded. And they leverage the Metaplex token metadata program. So a lot of the state and traits of what an xNFT are purely just inherited from that protocol. So you can see we're leveraging the same constraints as to what the length limitations for a metadata URI are, as well as the name. Some of these are, like the name restriction is actually just a runtime level limitation. So it's 32 bytes because your individual seed length limit is 32 bytes. So if you're trying to seed an account that you're initializing off of a string, that string has a max of 32 bytes. So that's more or less just like a Solana runtime thing. But nevertheless, still just leveraging what Metaplex uses so that we can be as consistent and compliant with them as possible. So let's start running down the list here of what we actually store in the account. So the publisher is just the pub key of the person who initially created the xNFT. So even if you were to create an xNFT app and then later want to transfer it to somebody else, or you sell it or something like that, your pub key is always going to be set as the initial publisher of that xNFT. So you're still there. The install vault, it will default to the publisher, but can be updated later down the road. And this is the account that receives any payments for installations if it's an app that has a price to it. So if you on the xNFT set that you want the installation to cost 2 Sol or something like that, then every time somebody installs it and pays 2 Sol, this is the public key of the account that's going to receive those funds. So you can keep track of that. The master metadata and master mint accounts are what you would think of as the metadata and mint accounts for a standard NFT. We just keep track of them here at the top level to prevent as many like recursive account fetches and deserializations as possible. So we can just, instead of getting an xNFT account and then getting the NFT account of the xNFT to then get the metadata, we just store it at the top level so we can avoid all of that issue. Installation authority, it's optional, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but basically sets an account who has to either approve or set delegated access on an xNFT to allow people to install it. So this basically provides some sort of quasi privacy to privacy or like token gating to the installation of an xNFT. The curation status, so you can set a curator on one, and this is going to be useful in the future for app stores and websites who want to aggregate and manage the lifecycle flow of xNFTs for possibly legal compliance reasons, where if they need to control or constrict the flow of xNFTs on their site, they can do so by having a verified curator wallet that they manage assigned to the xNFT, so that they have to co-sign the publishing or any updates. Maybe not publishing, updates for sure though. The URI is just a link to the remote metadata JSON blob like you would see in a normal NFT. You can see here in the comment basically saying the length of it is 4 plus the URI length of Metaplex, which is 200 bytes, I believe. Mint seed data is optional because it's not relevant for collectibles, but for apps it is. So the purpose of this is to maintain a Genesis entry record of what the original name of the xNFT is, because that name is used as a seed for the master mint account that we mint if it's an app. So if you were to update your xNFT, one of the fields that you can update is the name, but if you were to change the name, then we fundamentally lose the ability to derive the PDA of the mint because that name is different. So we have to keep the original name in in the account as a record so that we can go back and reference and rederive that account address if we need to. So if you initially create an xNFT app, that's my app, and then want to change the name at some point to um, my new app or whatever, then this will still be my app. So you can go back and reference that for account seeding purposes. Tag is an enum defined somewhere in here, down here. So these are kind of like categories for the App Store to be able to curate and group different ones together. This is by no means a static list. If there's a category that should be added that people feel like is missing, then I can come in here and add it, or somebody can add it and deploy a change to it. But that's basically just a tag for categorization and grouping when listing sites for xNFTs. Supply optional, but you can think of it sort of as the same sort of supply for an NFT, but for installations. So if you want your xNFT to only be installed by the first 100 people or something like that, then you can come in here, set a 100 supply on here, and we keep track of, can you increase the font? Yeah, sure. Then we can keep track of the amount of installations that are active against this supply, and basically just like stop that 101st person from installing on a protocol level. I don't think anybody really uses this. There were a couple people who've used it for testing or like preventing installations while they were still testing live in mainnet, but that's all I've really seen it for. Total installs, pretty semantically accurate to what it is. It's just a ticker for keeping track of how many installations you've had over time. Install price, if you want people to pay to install it like you would on like the Apple App Store or something like that. This is in Lamports. So the install price in Lamports. Original creation timestamp, last updated timestamp, self-explanatory. Total rating is a tally of, so like you can create a review for an app on the App Store. And this is a continuous incrementing count of the total rating of everybody. So if you have 2 5-stars and a 4-star rating, then this total rating is going to be 14. And that continues on logically for however many reviews you have. And then this coincides with the number of ratings so that we can calculate basically like your average rating for display in the App Store with the asset dash. So they've got 3 reviews that are all 5-star, right? So they've got 5-star rating. Awesome team, by the way. Shout out to you guys. Suspended is a flag basically just to either say people can actively install this or we should halt all potential installations. So if you have some sort of security flaw in your xNFT that you find, or for some reason you just want to stop people from being able to install it altogether, that you can go in and suspend the xNFT. And that's an option for apps in your /me page on the App Store. Bump, everybody should know what a bump is if you're here for developer reasons. It's the nonce value for your PDA. And then some reserve space for future changes. Any questions about any of the state or the purpose, feel free to throw in chat as I continue on. Length here, constant length, this is more or less just for unit testing purposes and for setting the length in account initialization that you'll see in the instructions. We have a try new function here just to instantiate a new instance of the xNFT state struct that sets defaults if there are defaults and takes in some of the parameters from the creation instructions. Pretty simple. As seeds is a convention that I typically use to abstract away for PDA signing seeds in instructions. So you don't have to duplicate that logic in every instruction that needs it. Um, the only, I guess that's not really a downfall, but like you can't use const generics that Rust does support. I just don't think Anchor can handle them at the moment. So you have to know how many seeds are in that so that you can return it. So as long as you know the static list of seeds that are expected for a PDA, then this kind of convention will work. But this is just abstracting common logic away from instructions so it can be called consistently from one spot. And take advantage of the master seed and the master mint and the bump that are in the state of the instance it's called on. Verify install authority. So this is basically just checking the pub key that's provided, and if there is an installation authority set on the account, that it checks that they basically match. And if it doesn't, it'll throw a protocol error and just terminate the instruction. Sort of the same thing for the supply. It's checking to make sure that the current supply is basically within the bounds of the total installations. And this is, when called properly in the instructions, this is what prevents that 101st installation from happening if it has a supply set of 100 or something like that. Down here is just some of the helper structs that you saw in the state above. So the curator status for setting a curator on an xNFT, you've got the pub key of the wallet and a flag to say if it's verified or not. If you were to go and look at the state of all of the xNFTs that have been published on the App Store so far, you'd see that all of them have a curator set on them with a pub key that is a pub key that we manage, but all of them should be false for verified. And that's because we don't quite yet want to turn on curation. But in a future state, if we do need to, then all we would need to do is come in and just verify this curator status. And then for whatever reason, if anybody needed to, we could gate updates through the App Store. Kind is, oh, did I skip that up here? Yeah, kind up here. Kind is at the moment, where am I? This is what happens when my font is too big. At the moment, we just have apps and collectibles. So an app is a standalone singleton NFT that is treated as a installable, functionable application within Backpack or whatever system wants to support xNFTs. A collectible is a soul-bound xNFT to an existing NFT. I've said this a lot in like Discord and different chats and stuff, and it still causes a lot of confusion with people. So feel free to ask for clarification. But a collectible basically assumes that there is an existing NFT or collection of NFTs that you want to permanently soulbound and associate an xNFT with, and you're basically just linking them forever. So anywhere that NFT goes, the xNFT will follow. Anybody who owns that NFT will also own the xNFT. If you soul bind to a collection of NFTs, then it is accessible functionally from every NFT item in that collection. That's an implementation detail on the client side, but that's how it works in Backpack and how it should work, in my opinion. But I guess that's up to whoever writes the implementation for the platform that supports it. We already went through the tags, and then there's just some cargo tests down here for some of the stuff above. So that's xNFTs. Hopefully that's not too overwhelming. It's pretty simple. Let's do installations next. So an installation, a lot of people originally thought that an installation would have been a new edition mint, in the sense of like a traditional edition of how you would see it in Metaplex, where there's like a master edition, and then depending on the state or type of NFT, you can also mint additional editions. We tried that originally, and it just didn't work because of some of the sacrifices you have to make on a Metaplex protocol level. where if you use the master edition flow and then like sub editions and stuff, you have to relinquish authoritative control over the mint to Metaplex. And that was, once we figured that out, that became a non-starter. So we don't do anything with additions. Addition here is semantically sort of incorrect, but that's not associated with the Metaplex edition. But an installation is just a PDA that gets created that represents temporary access to an NFT, an xNFT, if that makes sense. Hopefully it will when we get into the instructions. So the authority field here is just who this is associated with. So if I go into the App Store and install TXO, another awesome team, go download their xNFT, then this is my pub key because I'm the one who installed it. The xNFT pub key, shouldn't need to explain that. Master metadata is the same as the master metadata on the xNFT. Again, this is just for data abstraction and reducing dependent and recursive get program account calls. So when you log into Backpack and you go to your apps page, instead of getting all of your installations and then getting all of the xNFTs of the installations to then get the metadata, we can just get the pub key of the metadata straight from your installation. Addition here is just the sequential counter of your personal installation. So let's go over and look at an example. Let's look at Jito. So Jito's got currently 367 downloads. It's already installed on this wallet, but if somebody else were to come here and download it and be that 368th, then in your installation PDA, addition here would be 368. So that's just the incremental counter on a global scale of which installation for that xNFT that you have. I don't really know why that's useful, but it could be in the future, so we have it there. And then some more reserve space for future stuff like you saw in the xNFT. And this is pretty common and consistent across the protocol and other protocols. If just like a little tidbit here outside the context of xNFTs, if you're writing a protocol and you're going to make it mutable for whatever reason, whether that's you think it's right or wrong, if you're going to keep the protocol mutable and make changes to it in the future, you should more or less always have reserve space at the end of every program account in the protocol, because you never know what's going to need to change, and you don't want to have to basically rim wrap and break your entire program to make a change like that. Because if this reserve space isn't here, and we've been going through the whole xNFT stuff as we have been previously, and then all of a sudden I have an epiphany one day and say, oh, well, we should probably have I don't know, the created timestamp in here, right? Well, that's technically fine. Like, it's cool to add fields and stuff, but now the account space of what an installation is completely different from what it was before. And now all of the memory compares for, and data size compares for get program account calls, which is fundamental to fetching account data on RPCs, is going to break. It'll be fine for all future versions of that PDA or that program account, but you're going to fail to fetch any of the previous versions of that installation because it's going to have a data size comparison in it. If you're using Anchor does it by default. If you're doing a straight like connection get program account with filters and stuff, I guess you can ignore that and just not provide a data size thing. But if you're doing it through the Anchor SDK, it's going to have a data size comparison in it, and you're going to fail to fetch all of the previous versions because the data sizes are going to be different. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Try to have reserve space for any potential future additions. Const length for initialization, like you saw in the xNFT state, the same kind of constructor function like you saw on xNFTs. The try new try new because it could fail on the other one, and this is just new because there's no reason it would ever fail. Um, and you can see here we're also passing in a mutable reference to the xNFT account on chain as well. So when we're instantiating the instruction, we can also go ahead and increment that total installation count for the xNFT itself and keep track of that, which is nifty. Yeah, just more code test. Oops. Let's see, what next? Reviews. Reviews are only done through the App Store at the moment. So if you feel so inclined to go in and say, hey, Jito, pretty sweet app, let's leave a review. You can come in here, do that, leave a comment that gets stored off chain, and submit. This will create a program account that represents that and does the mutations on the xNFT account. So the author, that would be me in that example. xNFT, self-explanatory. The rating is that 0 through 5-star rating that you're giving it through the interface. The URI is going to be the URI of the off-chain metadata blob that holds that comment data, if there is one, and then some more reserve space in here. Again, these are pretty simple program accounts. There's nothing super special happening in them. So again, you have a const, or I guess it's not const here because we need to know the URI length, but we have a length in here. We've got an instructor in here, constructor in here that does the ranking, incrementation, and the incrementing of the total rating count. Or the total rating and the number of ratings incrementing. What was the last one? Access. So access, this kind of gets back into the installation authority. So what dictates when to store on chain versus in a database? In a database. Anything that is referenced on chain via a URI should have a publicly accessible endpoint or URL for that data. So obviously Backpack is the only one that I know of that supports xNFTs. So I guess in theory, like a database UID or something like that would be sufficient as well. But what happens if like Phantom comes along and says, well, now we want to support xNFTs? Well, they don't have access to our databases, and we're not going to give them access to our databases. So how are they going to get that off-chain data, which would be like the comments, or for the xNFT's sake would be the name, description, the entry points, the link to the code bundles to load, and all of that stuff. The only way to do that is to have a public endpoint that provides that data via JSON blobs. And that's how Metaplex does it for all of their stuff. And that's sort of what you kind of have to do if you want other people outside the scope of your security bubble to implement your protocols. Hopefully that makes sense and answers that question. So this goes back to private xNFTs. So if you have an installation authority on one, there's kind of two options for allowing installations that I'll get into once we get to the instruction more, but it's basically a cosign multi-sig sort of deal where the installation authority and the wallet who is receiving the installation are both signers of the instruction or the transaction, which works in very small number of use cases. But the other option is to give delegated access to people. So if I have a private xNFT and I want Armani to be able to install it, then what I do is create an access program account under his name for that xNFT, right? Under his name, under his wallet address for that xNFT. And then when he goes to go create a permissioned installation, he can, and you'll see that instruction in a bit, But this access program account is kind of used as an auth token to say like, hey, I'm a wallet who has an associated program account for access that represents permission to come install this. Now give me my installation. So that's kind of what this is for. It's really just like an auth token type of mechanism, for lack of a better term. But the wallet here would be the wallet who is being granted access through this mechanism. The xNFT is the app they're being given access to. Bump and reserve space, basic constructor length stuff. Nothing super special, just a representation of a mechanism. So that's that. Parameters in here, these are instruction parameters that are set. Yeah, nothing super special. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hope everybody's doing well. So that is that. Yeah, you'll see these in action in the constructor. Oh my God, instructions. Too many words. Too early in the morning. All right. So that's it for state. There's not a whole lot of state being kept compared to a lot of other big protocols. There's really just one, two, three, four types of state. Serialization here is just a bunch of custom implementations for debug and CERD serialization for the CLI. It's nothing related to the actual program other than managing the accounts and the serializable and deserializable things. You can see in the mod, this doesn't even exist if it's not a test or being built with the CLI flag. But yeah, this is just debug and serialize, and a bunch of tests for them. Test your stuff, it's important, even if it's annoying. All right, instructions. Let's get to the meat of this. So this is create app xNFT. There's two create instructions, one for apps and one for collectibles, mainly because of the differences in the accounts that are provided or need to be provided and the different constraints for them and what makes sense. So start with the app here. So an app requires a few different accounts, not too many, honestly. A lot of these can be auto-derived by Anchor if you're using a seed derivation when you build. But we initialize, initialize a mint. We initialize a token account for that mint. The Metaplex metadata, this is unchecked right now because it's initialized via CPI call. So it's just there's like no validation to be done there. And then the xNFT that gets initialized as well. You can come in here and look at the different seeding that happens if you want to, but there's nothing too special. I mean, it's like the seeding for the metadata account here is predefined by the Metaplex protocol standard, so it has to be this way. I kind of touched on this going through the state stuff, but the mint itself is seeded off of the publisher and the original name that's provided to the instruction. And what else? The xNFT is from the mint itself. So they're technically soul bound like that. In the same way that a collectible xNFT would be soul bound to an existing mint, an app xNFT is soul bound to a mint that we create for you in atomically with everything else. Let's see, payer, publisher, 99% of the case, this is going to be the same wallet, but just for extensibility's sake, having them separate. So if there is a reason there's two signers that are separate, one a payer and one the publisher, then you can do that. And some const program type stuff. Nothing too special there. This implementation block just holds the creation for all of the CPI contexts that are needed. So creating the metadata account for Metaplex, freezing it, freezing the account, doing the mint into the associated token account. And you can see it's an ATA here. It's not just like a random floating token account. It's an ATA that's owned by the publisher for the mint that's being created. And that's important. I think in one of the original versions of the protocol that I wrote, they weren't ATAs. They were just kind of floating token accounts owned by the program or something. Quickly found out that that was not the right way to do it and fixed it. Let's see, signing the metadata and setting it so that the primary sale has happened. This, I don't know if this is necessary. A while ago, we read some docs from Metaplex basically saying like if there are royalties or payments associated with the transfer of something, then having this flag set on the metadata account changes how those funds are transferred between creators, or I don't know, something like that, but we set it anyway. And then the bulk of the instruction, so the handler stuff, takes in the name string that's provided to the context up here, so we can do the mints, the seeding, and then the parameter structure that you saw over here. Nope, come on. There. So you can sort of see that as a reference. Okay, so some validation being done initially, making sure the URI is within the bounds of what the limitation is, getting immutable reference to the account, attempting to instantiate it with the parameters and the accounts provided in the context, and setting it to be an app, since this is the create app xNFT instruction. We do the token account mint, so we just mint one amount of the 0 decimal mint to the ATA that's being created. And then we freeze that ATA. This is something that we've gone back and forth with a couple times, whether this is useful or necessary or what have you. We're not convinced either way, but for what we're doing now, regarding how transfers work and stuff, which we'll get to, this is kind of what we need to do at the moment. Just setting temp variables to set the metadata as mutable and that the update authority is the same as the signer. And that'll be used in this block here, you can see. Creating the creators array or vector for the person who published it. And this is actually provided via the parameters. So it's not just the publisher. You can, if you're using the SDK, it'll append the publisher to it, but you can provide other people as well. The reason we can't set verify here is because not every creator is going to be a signer. So while they may be on the account as a creator, you're initially going to be not verified, because if I'm co-creating an xNFT with somebody on my team, I don't have their wallet to co-sign this transaction with, so they can't be verified. So we just don't verify anybody, because it doesn't really make a difference for this stuff. But if you want to, you can come in and verify yourself as a creator post-creation. CPI call to Metaplex to create the metadata account with all the data populated as necessary. For apps, there's no collection. There's no predetermined amount of uses or additional collection details or anything like that. This is a singleton that just like sits by itself. So we just set what we need to set as required by Metaplex. We sign it so that the publisher can be verified. But if there are other people who are in the creators array that aren't the publisher, then they will not be, which may or may not be fortunate, but they can still go do that at some other later date if they want. Update primary sale, CPI, whether that's necessary or not, who knows, but it is. It's happening. And then we emit a created event. So yeah, nothing too scary or complex going on here. Really just some verification being done a local program account, initialization, and then some CPI calls where necessary. That's not necessary anymore. All right, create collectible. So this is if you're soul binding to an existing NFT. So this is something like Mad Lads or Sports Labs. I think they're doing this. Actually, I know for a fact they're doing this. Rogue Sharks, I think, just did this. So more and more people are doing it, which is cool. This provides basically the so if you come in, these are the apps. I don't have any installed on my ledger at the moment. These are all built into Backpack that we built in-house, kind of like how if you have an iOS phone, there's like the weather app and these kind of things that are just like built in by default. You can turn most of these off by going into your preferences and turning off developer mode. And then you go back and it's just like prices and a link to the App Store. But I am developer, so it is on. But then if you come in here, you can see that these are all your NFTs, your collectibles. If I go into my Mad Lads and, oh, I guess we turned ours off, so I can't show you. That's unfortunate. Backpack Dev 1, cool. Open this up. So you click right through it into your collectible. So that's what a collectible type is versus an app. You soul bind to an existing NFT. So yeah, a lot of this stuff has been gutted. Like this is a super simple instruction because you're just inheriting a bunch of data from an existing metadata account. So instead of creating a new master mint, we are just expecting one to be provided that has one supply and 0 decimals, which is the standard definition of an NFT on Solana. We expect the associated token account of that NFT. And we've got our constraints here, making sure the amount matches the supply and the mint matches the master mint that's up here. How much longer are you going? I can tweet this from Backpack too. There's a lot of stuff to go over, so I'll be here for a bit. I've got no other plans today. Let's see. Master metadata. Yeah. Master metadata, again, expecting an existing account. So we make sure that it is mutable because if somebody has an NFT that they have purposefully marked as immutable for the rest of ever, then we don't really want people to be able to soul bind to it because that would be, while purely additive and an abstraction, would still be technically like a wrapping mutation to what exists. And that kind of breaks the ethos of what immutability is. So we only allow this to function and the soul binding to happen if that metadata is mutable. We make sure that the update authority is the person who is publishing and signing this transaction because I shouldn't be allowed to go create a soulbound xNFT for Rogue Sharks or for Oogie or any of these other people. It just doesn't make sense. I'm not trying to hijack their project, and we don't want other people to hijack projects and create xNFTs that are masquerading as official when they're not official out of the team who owns the project. That poses a huge security risk. So making sure that the publisher is the same update authority of the target metadata account. Same seed constraints here off of the master mint, and we're initializing the xNFT. Same separation of payer and publisher accounts. Excuse me. As you saw in the previous instruction. So that's it for accounts. The actual handler is just doing the same URI verification in the parameters for the length to make sure you're not going to blow state length limitations. And then instantiating the xNFT data on the program account from what's provided. Um, no seed name being provided here because you didn't initialize a new master mint, so there's no seed name to maintain history of because that master mint is referenced elsewhere and it wasn't seeded with a name that you provided. At some later state, so right now, collectible and app instructions both expect the same parameters, um, like this create xNFT params, which is defined here. At some point, it probably makes sense to separate these because they aren't necessarily coincidable. The app expects a lot more than a collectible does. A collectible really only cares about a tag and a URI. And an app needs all of these. So maybe some sort of like polymorphic parameters or something like that to separate them out to reduce data flow into the instruction. Yeah, that's it for collectibles as far as creating them on a program level goes. Again, super simple. There's like this isn't a common complex protocol by any means. Functionally, xNFTs provide a whole host of client-side application possibilities and features and all of this really exciting stuff. But under the hood, it's pretty simple, honestly. It's just getting started and seeing what's going on so you can look at it. All right, the create install instruction. So if you go in here, install, that's a bug. I'll look at that. But if you come in here and click install on something, then that's this instruction most of the time. So we expect the xNFT being installed. We make sure it has to be an app because it doesn't make sense to install a collectible. And we make sure it's not suspended by the creator so that they want to allow installations to happen. The installation vault, we make sure it's the same as on the account. No verification needed for this because as long as we're verifying that it's the same on the xNFT, we don't really care. We don't really care what it is or what type of account it is. It's ultimately just going to end up receiving some LAN ports as payment. So that doesn't really matter to us. The install program account, so we derive based off of the xNFT and the wallet receiving the installation. But that's just program account initialization. I guess this could technically be payer to follow the other conventions, but yeah, just separation of payer and target, I guess. Same thing as you've seen in the other ones. In here, we're verifying the supply. You saw that function earlier on the program account state. For anybody who missed it, this is just checking that if there is a supply limit set on the xNFT, that the current total installations of the xNFT is less than that supply limit. So if there is a supply of 100, we're not breaking that supply by being the 101st installation. Verifying installation authority. Again, another function you saw earlier, but if you missed it, this is checking that if there is an optional installation authority on the xNFT, that it matches the authority being provided in the context. So while I was explaining that okay, so here's where I can talk about it. So I explained earlier about like quasi-private xNFTs, right? So you can do that delegated access stuff, or here's where you can do a co-signed instruction for some weird use case where you have access to both private keys. So if I have an xNFT that I made private by putting my wallet as an install authority on it, and for some reason somebody gives me their private key, then I could set them as the target here. We both sign the instruction and then they can receive the the installation. Otherwise, this just allows me as the owner to install my own xNFT if it's private, because I would both be the authority and the target. Um, if there is an installation price on it, then we do that sole transfer of the price in land ports from the authority to the vault marked on the app. We instantiate a new program account, and then we admit that it was created, and then grade success. It's an additive standard that sits on top of other standards, so you can have Metaplex NFT be an xNFT, or ERC 721 can be. Yes. It doesn't exist on Ethereum at the moment, but that was something that was being looked at, and I don't actually know the current state of it. But potentially in some perfect world future state, this would also be on the EVM platforms and usable for ERC 721. Moving on. Create permission install. So this is using that delegated access flow with like the program account. That's an auth token that I mentioned. More or less the same as the previous create instruction, but it expects this access program account. Verifies the seeds, make sure that the xNFT is the same that's being passed in, and make sure that the wallet assigned to the access account is the same as the authority signing. So this would be if I delegated access to somebody else on the team. If I delegated access to Tom, shout out to you, Tom, to install my private xNFT, then we're basically just making sure that he's the one signing this instruction, and this is his delegated access account so that he has permission to install it. Under the hood, inside the handler, more or less the same stuff. Verify the supply. No need to verify the installation authority because this is a delegated access install, so we're verifying the permission based off of this program account. Initialize, emit. Nothing too special here. Create review. Let's see. The install account. Make sure it's got the same, we're passing in the same xNFT. Making sure that the installation authority, let me rephrase because that can be confusing with the private stuff. The owner of the installation is the author and submitter of the review. So this basically prevents from, not really, because there's ways around it if you're smart enough, but it is a mitigation measure against Sybil attacks. If you don't know what a Sybil attack is, it's look it up, but TLDR is basically just people creating false identities or multiple false identities to overload a reviewable item to mask. It's basically just like malicious social engineering. So this prevents people from the same wallet submitting a ton of negative reviews or positive reviews, multiple ones off the same account. So you have to have an installation. That installation is matched with the author. If they don't match, then it fails. Master token here is just verifying that it's like a valid NFT, I guess. We do this to make sure that the author isn't the one submitting the review, because that's kind of gamey. I don't want people submitting and creating apps and then just shilling their own apps in the reviews, because that's kind of shady. But yeah, this just makes sure that it's a valid ATA for the mint of the xNFT, and the owner's not the author. The xNFT itself, we make sure it's an app. Maybe this changes to not be a constraint, but in the current state, it doesn't really make sense to review collectibles because there's no like public perception of whether they're useful or not. They're just there if you own the NFT or an item in a collection that has an xNFT. Um, and again, we're making sure the publisher of the xNFT is not the author, so you can't show your own app. Initializing the review account, the author, payer, making sure that the rating provided in the parameters is not larger than 5, or whatever we determine the max rating is. So if it is larger than 5, then we throw an error. That's kind of confusing, honestly, but functions the same. Initializing it and event emission. Simple stuff. Delete install. Yeah, there's like nothing to go over here. There's just verification to make sure that you're the authority, or the signer is the authority of the installation being closed. You can receive a payer, which is more or less going to be you, like the same as the authority more than half the time. And we're closing it and sending the rent ports back to the receiving account. There's nothing special there. More or less the same thing with the reviews. If somebody's closing a review, we make sure that they're the author of it. It's the same xNFT, and then we decrement the number of ratings and decrement the value of that rating from the total rating. So if you had previously given an app a bad review and then they update it to fix whatever you're complaining about, then the nice thing and moral thing would be to either well, there's no update review, but to remove your review and or create a new one. So this would remove the status of your old review if they were to update this stuff. Delete xNFT. Yeah, this is pretty new. Not sure if there's ever a reason to do this. Yes, this is being recorded. It'll be up on my Twitch page for however long Twitch decides it stays up, but it's being recorded. I think it's going to end up on our YouTube page or something like that. So yeah, I actually don't really want to go over this one too much just because it's not very useful, but basically just make sure that the accounts are lining up, and if it's an app, then we make sure that there were never any installations so that there's no hanging program accounts on it. Because you can imagine if I don't know who the number one installed one is right now. Asset Dash maybe. So Asset Dash has 2,800 installations. And you can imagine if for some reason they decided to delete their app, then you would have 28 broken and corrupt installations just floating out there in the ether. That would cause a lot of problems. So for apps, right now, we mitigate it to only allow deletion of apps if there were never any installations and there were never any reviews. Because the same thing with floating accounts and hanging data would occur with review program accounts. Maybe this changes later and there's a better way to do it, but this is how it is right now. If it's an app, then we also burn the token and close the ATA. The reason this is only for an app should be pretty straightforward. For a collectible, you don't want to burn the underlying token, because like if for some reason somebody decided to burn or delete the xNFT that's soul bound to their collection or to a single NFT item out there, then they would also end up burning the token and burning their token account. So they would just that NFT would be destroyed. So this only happens for an app. If it is a collectible, then none of this occurs. the only thing that happens is the xNFT program account gets closed. So the underlying token is never harmed in any way um, if it's a collectible. If it's an app, then it should all get closed, but I diverge. Donate. So this is another fairly new feature, maybe a month or two. Don't remember when I added it. But you can donate an amount to the creators here, and it shows you who they are if there's multiple creators. Um, yeah, so if like I feel so compelled to donate 15 Sol to Asset Dash, then the creator on the account would get 15 Sol. If there's multiple creators, then it gets divvied up amongst them evenly. Yeah, making sure it's an app type, and then the metadata matches what's on the account just for verification. Making sure that it has creators, and making sure that the accounts provided in the remaining accounts, because it could be a dynamic list, we can't account for that in the standard context stuff. So we use remaining accounts. We make sure that that dynamic list of accounts is the same length as the creators. And then in here, we also verify that the pub keys match for the accounts and the creators. And then we do the division of the equal proportions and then send the Sol out. Granting access is for those delegated access program accounts. Yeah, nothing too special here. Just a standard account initialization, seeding off of the wallet and the xNFT. So if I am granted access, it's seeded off of the app I'm being given access to and my pub key. Create the account data and emit the event. There's nothing in there. Revoke, just the reverse of grant. So you can revoke access. All of this is actually pretty newly available on the App Store too. I think I added this a week or two ago for a different team who needed it. But if you have a collectible in here on your page, you can go into this access button if it's compliant with what you're trying to manage access for. And you can kind of a shitty UX at the moment, but if you have a list of pub keys, you can just new line delimitate up to 5 of them at a time and then revoke or grant, and it'll bundle all of them into a transaction and send it off. So that's in there if anybody needs it as of a week or two ago. So yeah, revoke just closes the account, checks the seeds, nothing special. Set curator verification. So this is for that curator status on an xNFT, just setting verified to true, making sure that the curator signing the account is the same one that may or may not be set on the xNFT, and failing if they don't match. It's a variable flag, so you can provide true or false depending on if you want to assign yourself as an active curator or remove yourself as an active curator on an xNFT. I guess you can't add yourself, but you can like verify yourself or not, and then the owner can remove you. So on the App Store, we only show ones, which at this point should be every single one of them, but we only show ones that are tagged with our curator pub key in the account, even though it's not verified at the moment. Set curator. Yeah, so this is only callable by the holder of the token for the xNFT. So the active holder, not necessarily the publisher, because the xNFT could have been transferred. So we have to account for that. But verifying, we expect the associated token account being passed in to match the xNFTs, make sure it's got the token in it with the amount check, and then we verify that the signer is the active authority of the account. making sure that there's not already a verified curator on here, because if there is, that would not be cool. Very not cool. And then if that all flies, then we set it. So then once this happens, you could, in another world, like if Tensor or TXO or one of these other marketplaces want to support the transfer of xNFTs, where they're the curator, you as the owner could go in and set their curator key as the curator, and then reach out to them and say like, hey, can you verify this, for whatever implementation reason they may have. The curator mechanism is really just like a wallet gating for updates and stuff. It may change in the future, but the implementation details of how the curator is used client side is up for interpretation. It's just a on-chain data layer, and mechanism, I guess. Set suspended, you saw that the suspended flag on an xNFT just prevents or allows installations from happening. So if me as a publisher wants to prevent installations from happening, then I would come in here, set suspended true. That would set the flag on the account, and then create install here would fail because suspended would be true. Or false if you want to unsuspend it. Transfer here, this is another one that is kind of like up for debate as to whether it's necessary or the implementation is correct for what may or may not need to happen. But it's currently only for apps, making sure that the source token account matches the owner, making sure that the recipient matches the destination token account. Mint check on all three of these. But we basically just, so the apps, you may or may not have seen it. App types are frozen when they're created. The token account is frozen. So the first thing we have to do is thaw that token account so that it can be mutated. Then we execute the transfer of the amount from source to destination, and then we freeze the destination account. So it effectively has the same effect as, or the same outcome as what this freeze was. So it starts frozen and ends frozen, from source to destination. And then we close the source. And these contexts for CPI are defined up here in the installation block or implementation block. There was something I wanted to mention about this. What was it? Oh, yeah. This is partially why we decided not to do anything with Metaplex editions, edition accounts and master editions, because if you create a master edition of an NFT via MPL, you sacrifice authoritative control over that mint. So thawing and freezing of the accounts is not possible through your own protocol or something like that. I can't remember exactly the context of it, but I remember staying up, beating my head against the wall on the phone with Armani for like an hour and a half trying to figure out a way around it. And then we just said, screw it, no additions. Recording will be available on Twitch and hopefully, yes, that's correct. Yeah, that's transfer. Last one for the protocol is updates. This will probably expand as data and use cases expand, but at present, got the xNFT, we verify the consistency of the metadata, we check that the updater is, let's see, what do we do? Check the mints match, the amounts match. The metadata is mutable. And then this is kind of in a limbo state at the moment. So right now, curation on a protocol level is disabled. So even if we were to go set ourselves as the verified curator, Functionally in the protocol, it's disabled at the moment. Um, so these two accounts, like unchecked and signer, would be swapped if it were to be enabled. But right now, the updater, which would be the owner, um, signs it, and then we've got the update metadata CPI context creation here. If it's an app type, then we check to make sure that the ATA's owner is the updater. Um, and that's the reason they're different constraints based off of the type, which is why you don't see these constraints up here in the macro blocks. But if it's an app, we make sure that the token account owner is the updater. If not, then we error out. And if it's a collectible, we make sure that the update authority on the metadata account is the updater. Ideally, I think these can sort of be consolidated where this also happens in here, but they're sort of indicative of each other based off of the current situation. If the curator status is verified, then we check to make sure that the curator authority passed into the instruction is the same as the pub key in the status on the account. Again, that's not very useful at the moment since it's disabled with verification. But so all of the current xNFTs published through our app store has our curator authority on it. If somebody were to submit a transaction for updating where the curator authority is just like the system account or some other random pub key, this would fail. Or I guess this would never hit because it's not verified, right? But if it is verified, then it would fail. All right, there's this block for if we do updates to the URI or the name. So if the URI is changed, then we set the new URI in the xNFT. And there's an aside to this that I'll get to once I finish explaining this. So we set the URI on it. We don't set the name because that's not necessary. Well, there's a mint seed name on here, which should never change from any updates. But the name lives on the metadata account, so that doesn't have to do with here. But if it's an app, then we update the metadata with the new name and the new URI, which I'm failing to see at the moment. Yeah, URI. So yeah, they get propagated to the metadata account. The reason we don't do this for collectibles is because we don't want to screw with the original stuff. We have additive changes, but our metadata is an additive change to the original metadata of the underlying NFT that we don't want to necessarily touch at all. We want to leave that how it is. There's a mechanism in the App Store for collectibles to synchronize them. So if you have a collectible, this is going to say already in sync, but if you click this as the owner and it basically goes out and fetches the remote state of the collectibles JSON blob, and it fetches the state of the xNFT's JSON blob, because in theory the xNFT one should be a superset of the NFT one, but they are separately stored. Unlike, and this is kind of the aside, unlike an app, the URIs in the metadata account and the xNFT account should be exactly the same because there's nothing you're trying to preserve. So we just store the same URI in both, which is why, regardless of the type, it happens here for the xNFT account. But what this does is it fetches the remote state of the collectible, the underlying collectibles metadata. It fetches the remote state of the xNFT's metadata. And aside from the proprietary data that we add, it does a diff of the underlying JSON. Let me see if I can find an example here, actually. just look at this. So this is the underlying NFT data. This is MLP compliant, MLP, MPL compliant metadata that we pull and we extend, only additive extensions. So we check this to make sure that that is cool. In the diff, you basically just delete this object and then do a stringified diff of the rest of it. If it comes back as matching, then there's no synchronization that needs to happen. If it comes back as unsynchronized, then we take our additive JSON object and just copy over the remote state of the underlying stuff and publish a new version for the xNFT state. So you kind of, it's just a mechanism of saying like, hey, they're out of sync at the core data level, like core metadata level, ignoring the xNFT stuff. So let's take what the remote underlying one is and reappend our stuff to that new one and then republish it so that the two, from a pure Metaplex data standpoint, should always be in sync. And that's not automated. You have to check that. So if you're the owner of an NFT collection or an xNFT that has a collectible for it, and you update the metadata of the underlying NFT, you should probably come and synchronize the two because there's some things that rely on the consistency of them. It's not going to break anything, but the data could be stale if they're not synchronized. Is there a benefit of this outside of keeping NFTs locally on your phone or computer? Not quite sure I understand. Benefit of this outside of keeping NFTs locally on your phone or computer? Of the protocol or of the data synchronization? I'm not sure what exactly you're referencing. We make sure in this update, coming back to this, just that the primary sale happened is always true, and we persist the rest of the existing data on there, so that's preserved. The installation authority is always an in-place change. So if you have an installation authority on your account and you go to update, make sure you also pass that in as well. So in the parameters, everything is optional, right? But the problem with that is that the install authority being optional here is also optional in the account of the xNFT account. So what you may think as not providing it here because you just don't want to update it on the account is there's no way to tell if that's the intent or you're providing no option, no value here because you want to remove it. So in lieu of not being able to tell the difference of that, we just do an in-place change on that. Everything else is checked for values being provided. So it's not in place, it's conditional on a value actually being there. Supply. So there are some supply constraints that we wanted to do. So you can only update, you can always remove a supply. So if supply is none, then you're just going to remove it on the account entirely. But if you're trying to provide a new supply that is either a change from an existing one or you're going from no supply to a supply, then we make sure that it is always additive. So if you're going from no supply to a supply, then it has to be greater than the total number of installations. Otherwise, that would kind of break stuff. And if you're going from a supply to another supply, we make sure that it's still greater than what currently exists. And then we set it. If all of that checks, we update the timestamp of the last update, and then we emit that it was updated. So that's it for the protocol. I don't think it's too confusing. It's pretty simple. Not many dependencies because it's all additive stuff on top of MPL. But if there's any questions about that, feel free to blow them up in chat. Otherwise, I'm going to continue in a second. Trying to understand what problem xNFTs and Backpack are solving. I don't know if I understand the landing page. Are you referencing this? Not this landing page? Basically, xNFTs are functional abstractions over top of what the traditional NFT standard is. So instead of minting images that have no value outside of the art, what you can do is um, mint NFTs of code that's executable within the context of a client that supports it, so that now you can breathe functional life into your application via traditional on-chain ownership of NFTs, um, or leverage existing ones to add functionality to them outside of the art. So you can think of them almost exactly as the apps on your phone or something like that, where instead of the code for the app being owned by a company that is never going to open source it, that has total control over the whole life cycle, and there's like zero transparency to anything, um, and there's no real, I guess there's like legal ownership of it, but outside of that, there's like nothing proving that. With xNFTs, you get the same functional benefits and opening the doors for a whole lot of codification of functionality and codification of NFTs and how their current state is. But you also get the benefit of full transparency with your users, which if you're building in the blockchain ecosystem, you probably should care about. Um, but you also get verifiable on-chain ownership of it, as well as it being open source and accessible by the people who are your consumers and stuff like that. Um, Hopefully that makes sense. But if you're not a Backpack user, why? Um, but if you are, you should probably know that there's like an apps tab where you can launch all of your apps, um, and click through them in your collectibles tab if you own an NFT that is an xNFT, or an NFT that's in a collection that is an xNFT, or one of the two. Um, so this is the Backpack Dev wallet, but either way, if hopefully that answers that question. If there's not, feel free to continue to clarify. Um, let's see, where was I? So yeah, that's the protocol. Nothing super special there. Go through the CLI next. There is a CLI that I wrote for it just to wrap it. It works. I don't really use it because I don't need to, but if anybody wants to build it and use it locally, by all means, there's instructions for there's commands for fetching data from different account types, and this uses that serialization stuff I was showing you before, for deleting an xNFT if you fall within the confines of what's possible, or what the constraints are, for creating an installation, managing your access for other users, setting the curator, toggling suspension, transfers, uninstalling, um, unverifying yourself as a curator, and also verifying yourself as a creator. I don't know how useful this is for people. Maybe it's useful in the context of like a CI/CD pipeline or something like that, or like a GitHub action workflow where you want to automatically manage the life cycle of either an app or an installation, or something, or access. Maybe you've got like um, a repository that manages Terraform for infrastructure management, and in the CI/CD pipeline for that, you want to call instructions that either remove or grant access to people based on some like Terraform resource, a list of pub keys or something like that. I don't know. Just trying to think of a reason. Um, but yeah, this is here. Feel free to take a look at it. Again, nothing super fancy or special, just a bunch of wrapper functions for serializing and sending off transactions in the protocol. Let's see. So there is a TypeScript client. Um, this is the name of it. Feel free to use it. I change it all the time, so expect it to change. But it's kind of twofold here why it exists, and there's kind of a caveat to it. So this is what's powering the App Store, this client, um, which is not open source, and that's a different discussion. Maybe I go through that here. I'm not sure if it's something we can or should open source at some point, but at the moment it's not. But this client powers the App Store at the moment, and is the reason I built it, because I wanted to obfuscate a lot of the complexities of data fetching and parsing and aggregation away from the app code into something else. Um, but it's got client functions for all of the instructions as well as data fetching. It's like get multiple accounts by pub key, so fetching multiple xNFT accounts, getting reviews, granting access, all the instruction stuff. Um, get multiple accounts by filter, so kind, and then the traditional GPA filters. Get installations, get xNFTs by owner, these sorts of things that are useful from a client-side standpoint that should be kind of abstracted away. I'm not going to go too much into this client. It's here. You can take a look at it. It's in the TypeScript folder of the open source repository. If you've joined since I linked it and can't find it and don't want to go search for it, it's right there. um, But yeah, it's useful. It powers the App Store at the moment. The caveat I would say to this is it's not the most performant thing, and that's not necessarily its fault or my fault for writing it. I think one of the things as an ecosystem we need to acknowledge is that data flow for NFTs is absolutely atrocious. Um, Getting simple data for an NFT is probably the most convoluted and RPC intensive process you can do, especially if you're fetching multiple of them, and all of their off-chain data and stuff like this. It's not a network or computationally nice process. Um, so this entire SDK relies on those RPC functions, and it functions properly, and it's good at what it does. One of the things I would say about it is that if you want to avoid RPCs, don't do this. Don't use the SDK. A better thing to do would be to maybe use some combination of maybe use the client just for the anchor program that sits inside of it. So there's this private program, but you can also just read from it. It's a read-only exposed. um, so this is an anchor program that's serialized for the xNFT IDL, and you can use that for maybe like getting the raw deserialized xNFT data. But after that, I would highly encourage somebody who uses this for a production grade application to use an indexing service like Helios, another fantastic team. Shout out to you guys. Because unless you've got a really good RPC and you're fine with latency, it's going to slow stuff down. That's just the truth of it and the current state of data flow for NFTs on Solana at the moment, which is unfortunate, but it is what it is. Maybe compressed NFTs help with that later down the road, but that's just not how it is at the moment. So maybe I would use this just to read raw program account data and then use RPC indexing services like Helios and their API to get like the indexed metadata for mint addresses that are associated with xNFTs. But yeah, this SDK is good. I would just use it for like scripts or something like that, where you don't really care about latency, or excuse me, or something that just like isn't going to production with a ton of users. I would not, if that makes sense. But the other reason I wrote it is to also make the test suite a lot cleaner. So by writing and using this SDK in the tests, I'm testing both of them at the same time. So there's some, oh, the other reason you might use this is because it has Zod. If you aren't familiar with Zod, it's a object verification and strong type library. So you can do things like say, well, this schema has to be an object with these values that have these constraints. And then when you run an object through the schema, it parses and verifies all that for you. And I use this in the API that manages the publishing and the data verification flow for XNFTs published in the App Store. So the xNFT, if you're a publisher and you've gone through that, you'll know the xNFT.json file is like a JSON manifest in your zip that describes all of the data for that app or collectible. That JSON file gets pushed through these schemas to verify that the fields inside match what is expected for the certain type of XNFT you're creating, and can be used to set defaults for stuff that isn't provided in that file initially. So maybe if you want to leverage these schemas and the types that are generated from them, that's another reason to use the SDK. Because it's got the, not just that manifest stuff, but it's got the JSON metadata structure that we add to NFT JSON blobs, if that makes sense. I think I showed you an example before. I'll take a look at asset dashes. So this is this XNFT subfield of the JSON blob that's additive on top of MPL. This gets verified via this schema. So if you're building a platform that you want to support XNFTs and you need some sort of verification or validation of the types or the fields within that metadata object, then by all means use the client, if not only just to import this Zod schema and parse. What was I saying? So like there's some tests in here to test like core stuff, and the schemas and all. But using the SDK to power the anchor tests both at the same time. So it's less code, it's cleaner, and it's a lot easier to maintain and add to. So so instead of like using the raw program and going through all of the account serialization and stuff, I can just create an account from a client from the SDK and just call the function, which manages a lot of that data abstraction and mutation to provide a cleaner interface for people using the SDK, and requires less data to be provided. So the less amount of data that you need to provide to an SDK or a client to get the job done, the better. And that's what it does. So by using it in the tests, I can avoid all of the messiness of having random variables and data floating around that I don't care about, outside of the fact that it's required to serialize a transaction or an instruction. Yeah, there's some tests in here for private stuff, standard, collectibles. Nothing too fancy. I will say, and it's something that everybody points out all the time, which is very valid, is that the docs suck. If you even acknowledge that there are any docs. And that's just a function of prioritization and time, if I'm being honest. So down in the README on the repository, there's a link to protocol documentation that's sourced from this folder here. And you can read through here. It's got the README, it's got some stuff for the error types, the events, the different instructions, and some descriptions and links. Hopefully some of this stuff is useful. I don't know how many people have actually looked at it or even knew that this was here. But it is. You can come in here, and if you're just curious about documentation for the program itself, this could be pretty useful for you. It lives with the code and gets mutated as the code gets mutated as well. So this should never be out of date. But code for building and publishing xNFTs is pretty non-existent. Um, so it's being moved here. A lot of this points to or like describes flows and information that is deprecated. So this a while ago we had built a custom reconciler for React and a custom component library to be compliant with xNFTs and the rendering that we were doing at the time within Backpack. Since then, I think I mentioned we've moved to not so much insisting, but pressuring people to use React Native, which takes a lot of the maintenance pressure off of us, but also provides cross-platform capability to teams for future iterations. So if you want to build an xNFT, you can build it for a standalone website. You can build it for an app, a native app within Backpack. You can build it for iOS. You can build it for Android, all from the same code base, as long as you do it properly. And currently, the schemas for the additive data that we have support this. There's nothing that uses it at the moment, as far as I'm aware. But these entry points, again, if you're a publisher, you're probably familiar with this. Entry points. Yeah, so there's a default entry point that's always required. But you've probably only seen web, where web can be a link to a an existing website URI or to a file path for an entry point for code bundle that you're publishing. But theoretically, like we support allowing that data for Android and iOS apps as well. This isn't useful for Backpack, but it could be very, very useful for potentially Saga native xNFTs with the Android entry point, or maybe we make a new one for Saga if there ends up being a difference in how it's built. I have a strong feeling iOS may be irrelevant for a very long time, if not ever, but it's there. Like you can set one if you feel like building it, and it'll get published. But that's sort of useful. Are xNFTs tied to a Backpack user or to an individual wallet? Are you talking about the app itself or the installation of one? The app itself. It's tied to a wallet, not a user. So it's whatever wallet published it. We've been talking internally about some changes that may or may not happen about what that obfuscation looks like and the ownership model of that. But at the moment, for apps and installations, at the moment though, it's owned by individual wallets. Like if I install an xNFT, I'm going to be able to use it from wallet. Oh, okay. So you're talking about installations, not apps, like ownership of apps. Yeah, installations are also still per wallet. So if you look at the instruction at the moment, create install, the install program account is seeded off of the recipient wallet that's signing the instruction. So this kind of scopes it to a wallet, which makes sense in some cases, but for the Backpack use case can be super annoying. Because if you're a user and you have a bunch of hot wallets for different reasons, and a ledger, please use hardware wallets, people, for the love of God. That can be sort of annoying, right? Because if you've installed an app on one of your random hot wallets and you are currently like your active wallet is a different one, you should theoretically still be able to use that because it's under the same user. We're talking about how that changes the ownership model and what kind of things need to happen to make that the reality. But there's nothing set in stone for a future plan on that. If you sell an NFT and don't resync your Backpack, is there some kind of force unlink xNFT so that people get unlinked? So there's no reason to resync if you sell an NFT that has a collectible xNFT associated with it. The syncing is for the off-chain metadata if they become inconsistent. Um, but the xNFT is soul bound to the NFT. So if you go create an xNFT for, I don't know if you have NFTs or what you do. Say you have a Mad Lad because they're cool. Um, if you create, well, actually, that's a bad example because you can't because you're not the update authority. Say you create your own xNFT or your own NFT and you create an xNFT soul bound to it. If you were to sell that, you will still be marked as the publisher, but you're no longer the holder of the underlying NFT. So while you still may remain the update authority of it, you are no longer technically the owner, if that makes sense. Um, so yeah, there would need to be some sort of flow where like you sell it and then you also update the update authority of the metadata, and then that would completely disassociate you with that, if that's what you're talking about. Which I'm not sure if that happens anywhere at the moment, honestly. Um, Not that I'm aware of. If there probably is a flow where you sell or trade and atomically also change the update authority on the metadata, but not that I've heard of. Probably should though. Because in this backpack tracks the chain. Um, un unsync stuff. I guess I'm not sure what you mean by unsyncing. Um, Backpack does track on-chain events and data relating to ownership of NFTs and xNFTs. Um, there might be some cognitive disconnect between either you or I. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Um, so that's the xNFT repository. Hopefully that helps a lot with understanding the internals of it, the under the hood stuff. Um, yeah, docs need a lot of TLC. I'm so sorry. There's so many people have very valid complaints about it and confusion. I find myself answering a lot of the same questions in Discord and stuff on a daily basis. Just don't have time to write a bunch of docs, but I need to. We need to. So I will give you that. Is there anything else anybody wants to see or talk about relating to xNFTs or the App Store or anything? I'm down to talk about whatever. Cover off-chain storage. Oh, yeah, sure. Let's see. Nope, that's not what I wanted. So, yeah, this is an open source. I don't know if, I guess there's nothing wrong with showing some of this stuff. So, yeah, if you've been through the publishing flow, you know that we support AWS through S3, IPFS, and Arweave. We've got in the App Store common APIs for these. Um, so all of them should be able to handle uploading a comment data, uploading a JSON manifest, um, and uploading metadata. Or sorry, the manifest is not JSON, it's a zip file. The zip file manifest and the JSON metadata. Um, uh, so there's different implementations of this. I don't know if I should show the actual API code or not, but this is all client side. So we basically just have an API that manages the different implementations of what the storages are for the backends. I guess you said, for instance, I see images need a specific domain. It depends on where in the App Store you're looking. So the app is written in Next.js. So if you're not familiar, Next is a React framework that focuses mainly on server-side rendering for performance issues, or not issues, but for performance enhancement and data security. Um, they have this thing called image optimization. So image optimization is where your Next application server has a process that basically takes remote image URIs and does load time and format optimizations on them to decrease latency and increase performance client side. The limitation of this image optimization is that the app needs to have a predefined list of um, top level domains that it supports. Otherwise, it's going to just error out and say like, hey, this isn't defined. Like if you're trying to pull from mywebsite.com/images or whatever, and the owner didn't say that we're allowed to, or the developer said we're not allowed to optimize these. Um, very expensive financially. I don't think we pay for anything for the image optimization. We don't really hit any limits at the moment. Maybe we will at some point. Um, that's why some places in the app doesn't use it. Some places do. So like the images adding shadow drive. I've looked at it. I would like to add shadow drive. And this is shared within the team. Um, my thought process for it is that if it takes me more than like an hour to understand the implementation of how it needs to happen, then it's just not worth my time at the moment. And that was the case the last time I looked at Shadow Drive. Maybe it's gotten more UX friendly. I'm not sure. I should probably take a look at it again. But at the time, it just looked like a more expensive and confusing SDK than I had time to put into. Um, that doesn't change the fact that I want to support it and add it, but at the moment, I just don't have time to do it. Allow all domains HTTP. Yeah, I looked at their pattern stuff. I couldn't get it working. Maybe I'll next time I get a chance, I'll look at doing the image patterns for domains to open up the doors a little bit. Um, so the original question was what? For instance, I see images need a specific domain. Yeah, like sort of right now. This is where we expect most of the images being loaded from, and that's mainly because the images that we load should almost always be provided through that zip manifest that gets published. So if come in here, go publish a new one, this zip that we provide should contain the assets that are being loaded. So that's, go through an example. So like this icon should theoretically be pulled from the zip manifest that's provided. It gets published where they want to do their publishing to. So they selected AWS, so it gets stored in S3. Yeah, the icon's defined down here. It gets put up there as well. Screenshots are in that zip. So I think the reason you're seeing most of them coming from S3, Arweave, RIO, or IPFS, or like the NFT storage IPFS gateway or something like that is more or less just because like the only assets we tend to show in the App Store have been published via our publishing flow. So they go through our storage mechanisms and end up within these currently 3 buckets of storage, being S3, S3, Arweave, and IPFS. And Arweave being done through Bundler, which is awesome tool. Shout out to you guys. Um, so it's not that it like has to be on a certain domain. I think there's actually examples. I think like TXO uses their own stuff. Maybe not for images. I think their metadata. They host their own metadata. But yeah, that's probably why you're seeing what you're seeing. It's just because the assets loaded in the App Store are published through our flows and end up getting put into the domains under the storage mechanisms that we have implementations um, and processes for. What are the Chrome manifest permission limitations for xNFTs? What do you mean? Talking about like access to webcams and microphones and like those permissions? Um, you can request permissions for stuff like that. The limitation for that is on the let's see. It's on the iframes that we load them in Backpack. I can't open links. Yes, you can. And you wouldn't know this unless, never mind. I'm not going to show you Backpack from there at the moment. So you wouldn't know this unless you kind of asked or read through the code. But there's this provider injection package that we have that has implementation. Whoops, that's actually the wrong one. It's packet provider core. Has all of our implementations for our wallet adapter and our xNFT providers that are injected for both Solana and Ethereum at the moment. The xNFT one, because of iframe sandboxing, we can't allow just like the window.open API. So we have this a different one, open window function that gets exposed. So this would be it's not what I put. So this would be at window.xnft.open window within the context of an xNFT. So we've got that. We've also got open plugin. I thought it was called something different. Oh, there, yeah. So in here you can do open plugin and then the pub key of a different xNFT that you want to deep link to. So from within your app, you can trigger opening a different xNFT if you want to via that. I don't know if this still works or not. I know that was in question a while ago, but you could open up a chat group for a token gated chat. So if you are a Mad Lads holder and or if your users are Mad Lad holders and you wanted to have a button within your xNFT that triggers opening that token gated chat for those users, then you could do use this open chat. Assuming it still works. That there was a question about that a couple of days ago, but you could trigger opening that token gated chat for those users. So yeah, just take a look at. It's kind of confusing. There are limitations that are kind of bestowed upon us because of the sandboxing that we do with iframes in xNFTs, where we have to re-implement some of these things to use message passing between host and sub windows. But they're there. You just kind of have to look for them. And this is part of the stuff that like we need to document and just haven't had time to do, for lack of a better excuse. But they're there. Just kind of have to go looking for it or ask. Maybe even potentially read the docs on them one day. One that exists. But yeah, definitely still there. That's something that a decent amount of people have asked about and confused about, is like such a basic functionality is just opening a new tab or a new window from within the xNFT, but definitely still can. But as far as like cameras and microphones and stuff like that, I'm pretty sure you can still request those permissions from within the xNFT. But again, that was weird. I think my AirPods just died. Can you guys still hear me?
Hello? Yeah. Okay, cool. Um, but yeah, you can. What was I saying? Yeah, the permission list on the sandboxing for the iframes may be the blocker there. Um, but there's nothing like it's. They get loaded in a standard iframe window. So there's nothing functionally blocking from the requesting of those permissions. Um, but from using them, it could be an iframe issue based on what we allow. There's some people asking for us to allow arbitrary pop-ups for I think it was for like a payment flow because they're using Plaid for a payment flow, and Plaid's got their own pop-up stuff for logging in and linking banks and stuff. And it's some of this stuff is just a security concern that we don't want to allow to happen within the iframes. It's just that plain and simple. Like allowing an app to arbitrarily open up whatever pop-ups with any URI that they want is not an okay thing to do because you can easily take advantage of that. So yeah, there's that. Feel free to ask or request information on any other topic that has nothing to do with this as well. Let's remove xNFTs that are not working. Yeah, so we see them as they get noticed. The App Store has a filtering mechanism that's built into it and a whitelisting mechanism. So as we find ones and ones that get reported to us that are kind of deprecated or broken or haven't been updated since breaking changes, we basically just remove them from the whitelist of loadable xNFTs, and they get hidden from the App Store, and the installations are not openable in Backpack as we do that. There's obviously a far better way to do that, but it requires people to have a direct communication pipeline or some sort of automated flow to report that, which just doesn't exist at the moment. But that would be nice in a future state, to be able to have automated like deprecation reports or end of life reports for xNFTs that just immediately unwhitelist and filter them out from the app stores. Unfortunately, we couldn't just like delete them because that would require signatures on chain, and if somebody's just abandoned an app, then it's probably not likely that we'd be able to get in contact with them to to go out and delete it. So that kind of sucks, but that would be nice. What time is it? 11 o'clock. Or 12 o'clock, actually. Go away, Dana. We don't need trolls in here. Man, I was wanting to switch careers and become a software developer. Started doing C5X just prior to ChatGPT. Do you have any advice? Yeah, I don't know if like my advice on this is useful to people. I think I've had kind of a pretty unique path through my education and career, so I'm not sure how relatable it is, but I would say regardless of how intimidating or blocked you feel progressing with your skill set and your career, don't wait for motivation. Don't let motivation be like the driving factor for practice or development or anything like that, because what you'd end up having is just like random spikes of progression, and I feel like the results from random spikes of motivation aren't the same as just consistency. If you build yourself a mental model around daily goals, like I remember when I was first getting into the Solana ecosystem, um, actually the software Jedi here, um, Dana Hanna, is a friend of mine from a different life. um, he kind of got me into it and pointed me in the direction of Anchor at a super early time. This is probably like, I don't know, April 2 years ago, maybe like 2.5 years ago. Um, but I set a mental model and goal in my mind to be consistent every single day. Because if you have consistency, if you were to think about it like mathematically, you'd have a step function of progression instead of, if you wait for motivation, then you would just have like these random dips and dives. Um, but when I was first getting into the space and meeting Armani and working on the Anchor framework, I set a mental model in my mind where every single day I was going to close a code related issue. Every single day. Didn't matter how complex or simple it was. I wanted to close one issue a day that I sat down and looked at the current state of Anchor. And within a couple weeks, I found myself being a top 5 contributor for the framework and very deeply invested in this ecosystem and meeting and knowing a lot of people, making a lot of great connections. And through that, my first job in the ecosystem was as a back-end engineer and blockchain engineer for Jet Protocol. Ended up doing full stack work for them, but that's where I got my start in Solana outside of Anchor. And that just kind of opened the door for everything else. But I think the best advice I can give is just to never be the smartest person in the room, because you're never going to learn if you strive to be the smartest person in every room. But also just don't stop learning, no matter how intimidating it is. Take leaps of faith, throw yourself into the fire constantly, and dig your way out. I think not everybody is like me. I don't think that, but for me, that's the best way that I learn. If I just spend hours of my time way over my head in stuff that I don't know, so that I force myself to learn my way out. So those two things combined with just having a consistency in your mental mindset of, here's my progression goal for today. And then you get through that day, you get to the next one, and you just maintain that consistency. And not to mitigate the importance of motivation, because I think you have to be motivated and enjoy what you do to be successful. But it should not be the sole driving factor for your progression in your career or your skill set. You need to build habits. And as much as they suck, for me at least, I needed to adhere to those consistent habits on a daily basis to kind of push through the lack of motivation and the confusion and frustration of not knowing stuff at certain times. But if you just throw yourself constantly into it and you force yourself to dig your way out, then you come out with a much deeper understanding of the topic that you're looking at. Let's talk about AI helpers. Dana, you don't want me to talk about AI helpers? Yes, it is very painful shit. Thankfully, the ecosystem, for Solana specifically, has come light years since where it was when I first started. It may not seem like it, but at the time, people complain about the lack of documentation for xNFTs, and compared to what the state of Solana and dev tooling for Solana was when I first got started, the current documentation for xNFTs and Backpack looks like an encyclopedia compared to what existed at that time. There were no docs. The docs was the code. So if you wanted to know anything, you better know Rust and TypeScript if you wanted to read the Web3.js library. But to understand anything around Anchor or contributing to Anchor or knowing how Solana worked at all from a program or runtime level, you damn well needed to know Rust. So, yeah, docs are the current state is a lot better than what it was, but yeah, there's still a lot of glass showing that goes on. My workflow for installing new dev. I see manual deserialize match statements on first. Oh yeah, I don't miss that. I'm glad that that is not a part of my daily life anymore. What's your workflow to install new dev versions of Backpack? I don't think this is going to be the same for everybody else because I'm constantly working on Backpack. But just go to master, just yarn install, and then yarn build. I guess we'll build like a release version of it, or if you want like a dev webpack server like dev build, you can do start extension. And while after that finishes and it's running and stuff, you can come up to manage extensions. You can see I have mine turned off at the moment, but you would go to load unpacked, and then let's see, Coral, Backpack, packages, nope, packages, extension, dev, and then click select, and that'll basically load this up. I think there's another setting you have to set in your browser related to like self-signed certificates for extensions and allowing that. But then you can enable it and load it up and stuff. But yeah, there's no real, I guess for me as somebody working on it on a daily basis, there's no real workflow for getting the dev ones. It's just kind of indicative of writing code for it. How will xNFT store and dApp store play nicely on Saga? Personal question. xNFTs bring users to Saga, but lots of different pathways. Yeah, this is still sort of an open question. I don't know how much I can talk about it. But obviously native xNFTs on Saga is a fantastic end state. The App Store itself will likely become bundled into Backpack at some point. Whether that means there's still a standalone site that just gets like wrapped as an xNFT, or the standalone site goes away and I just rebuild it in React Native or something like that to be fully inside of Backpack and loadable in Backpack. That's sort of an open-ended question, but I think the ultimate end state is yes, to have native xNFTs running as native apps on Saga via our React Native push. And then as far as the App Store, maybe that's just from a Saga standpoint, something you just open up from within Backpack, or xNFT store is a separate app on Saga or something like that. I don't think there's a clear answer on that at the moment, but we have a path that we would like to take, and hopefully everything works out on that as planned. But that is very much TBD. Right now we're more so just focused on getting the app out in general and in a production state that we can release for people to use. We're not too concerned on that at the moment, but it's, at least in my mind, something that we would love to have. Yeah, sub-stores on iOS are just like not a thing. Yeah, I don't really have too much to say about that. You're not wrong. Like the Apple and Google both have very, very strong stances against um, stores that are not theirs, for lack of a better way of saying it. Especially anything that has to do with Web3, they tend to be very anti Web3. So we'll see how that goes. I think from a mobile standpoint, we're building backpack wallet functionality for Android and iOS, and then as far as like native apps and stuff in the App Store goes, um, eyes are more or less just set for Saga at the moment, as far as I'm aware. All right, Dana, I'll talk about your AI stuff. No, I don't use any AI helpers. I I don't want the government to read the code that I'm looking at and writing, and I think ChatGPT has its hands a little moderated by some nefarious actors. Whether that's true or not, but that's probably not. But no, I don't use any AI helpers. Like I use some VS Code extensions just for like formatting and auto completion and stuff. But no, there's like Black Box. Black Box. It seems like a cool extension. I've never actually looked at it or like installed it or anything. Um, Other people probably have. But this seems interesting. Like you just write comments semantically of what you want, and then it tries to generate them as best as you can. The only reason I feel like I would use something like this is for like super obscure CSS that nobody should ever know, but is necessary to do something. And just be like, I feel like everybody struggles at some point with just centering a div horizontally and vertically in different scenarios, and I just can't be bothered to memorize all the different patterns for doing that. Unless you use Flexbox, then it's easy, but you can't always use Flexbox. Can React fully access Android Saga feature set? That's a good question. Not React, but maybe React Native, which I guess is still React. I know people have built a lot of, like there's geolocation community stuff. I don't think it's built into the core APIs of React Native at the moment. This would be something that Peter on our team would be far more knowledgeable about than I would. But I know that people are constantly creating React Native wrappers for proprietary hardware APIs. So I wouldn't be surprised. It's just not part of, as far as I know at least, not part of React Native's core API. Permissions. Yeah, I don't know. I'd be shocked if you couldn't access some of that stuff. Because I mean, other apps like Uber and Lyft and all of these things are built in React Native as well. So unless they're building like side-loaded Swift or Objective C that leverages, or I guess for Android Java, if they're writing platform-specific code to leverage those hardware APIs and then side-loading that with the bundled React, then I guess that would work. But I'd be surprised if they aren't doing some of that stuff with some sort of third-party React Native APIs. All right, let's see. What else can we look at? Um, that might be useful. Yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else that anybody wants to discuss or talk about or ask? Coming up on 2.5 hours. Okay, cool. Well, if there's nothing else, then probably just wrap up here. Um, yeah, the recording will be up on YouTube at some point, as far as I know. I think somebody's going to upload it. But yeah, feel free to continue asking questions in Discord or on Twitter. I'm always around. More or less everything's open source, so go contribute. Now you know how it works. It's super simple and not intimidating at all. So come help us. We'd appreciate it. All right, everybody, enjoy the rest of your day or morning or whatever time it is.